Book of Joshua. Joshua chapter number 4 as we study through the book. Recall we were spending much time on these two chapters, chapter 3 and chapter 4, in dealing with the crossing over the Jordan River, where finally Israel is coming home, finally getting across that river. And it's interesting, like we made a point earlier, the last time, was that the fact that God spends 2 whole chapters talking about this crossing. It's important for us to see the spiritual parallels and applications for ourselves as well. So we see now, we left it where six priests would be standing in the middle of Jordan. And you think about, there are 3 things that we want to look at and think about this morning or this evening. And one is the fact that these priests were obedient to obey the commands of God and through Joshua. Not only were they obedient, but they were patient and enduring. And you think about this, remember we've shown you this box here. It's more than just a box. This box is actually the mercy, or not the mercy seat, but the Ark of the Covenant, okay? What's this on top? I gave it away. Mercy seat, okay? This is the mercy seat. The lid of the box is the mercy seat, okay? And the Lord spoke through this little place right through here between the 2 cherubim. That's where he would do business with the high priest. That's where his glory would shine, and that's where the high priest went in once a year, 2 times, once a year. And he went in for himself first, then he went in for Israel second, right? And he sprinkled the blood with a hyssop branch all over this. And this is the box that we're talking about. These 2 angels are solid gold, okay? They're solid gold. Now you can imagine how heavy that would be with those solid gold angels, all right? Everything on this is covered with gold, layered with gold. Okay, I don't know what you call it, not inlay, but the whole thing is layered in gold, okay? Even the poles that are carried, these, I think it's called shittim wood, S-H-I-T-T-I-M wood, they're layered in gold too. So you can imagine now the thing that is in this, remember the 2 tablets of stone, Aaron's rod and the pot of manna are in this box, okay? Now you can imagine the weight of that. Can you try to picture that, the weight of it with all that gold on it? How much that would weigh? Well, I don't doubt that it was heavy, okay? Now 6 men will be carrying that. 3 men on each side will be carrying this. And remember now, they have to carry it and have to stand there in the middle of the river while all of Israel passes by, okay? So you can imagine these men that are holding this box aren't weaklings, okay? They have to be strong in order to maintain and to hold this box up, this Ark of the Covenant up, while Israel is passing by across the Jordan River. And as you think about that, this would be a place of honor that they were standing in, but it's also a place of danger. They're standing there, and it's like an unseen hand is holding the water back, and they're crossing across again on dry ground, not across mud, but on dry ground. Now recall the river is in flood stage, okay? And what happens in flood stage? The banks get overflown, you've got logs and all that kind of stuff, mud, sand, all that stuff is washing down through there, cleaning out. Usually when it floods like that, it cleans out everything that's loose and then takes a few trees down and stuff like that. So here now, God has stopped the river. As soon as the priest's feet hit the water, boom, it dries up. It stands up on end. It says it stands up, and it's like an unseen hand holding that water back. So you can imagine these priests had to be kind of courageous. They had to be kind of in good shape to be able to hold that thing. Now remember, there's close to 1 million people that have to cross. Now how long would that take? It wouldn't be no simple, we're done. No. Remember, they're traveling by tribes. So they would go, and the first tribes to go would be the ones that defend, and we'll see that later on in the chapter. But all of those people would have to get across before the priest could get out of the path of the river. And you think about that, that's going to be a long time. Hours and hours, they're going to have to stand there. So they bore the ark before whose presence the waters had rose up like a heap held by an invisible hand. They advanced to the midst of the Jordan. They remained stationary for many hours until all the vast host of Israel had crossed over to the far side. So it would be a severe test of both their courage and their patience. I wish they'd hurry up. I wish they'd hurry up. I wish they'd hurry up. That kind of thing. So it would be a test of their courage, their patience, and their physical strength too. Because it was going to take a lot to hold the Ark of the Covenant for that long. So here we see an example left for the ministers of the gospel, and that's why it's important to look at these different applications when you're studying the Word of God. You see here that God spends much time in these 2 chapters just to give us some practical applications. Just as those priests would continue to hold out steadfast, so the gospel ministers are to continue steadfast in their duty, to be a model unto the people of uncompromising faith, of undaunted courage, and of patient endurance. So you see the application there? The gospel ministers. And you can say that about Christians in general as well, that they're to remain steadfast. They're supposed to have non-compromised faith, uncompromising faith, and they're supposed to be undaunted and courageous, supposed to be brave. And remember, Ephesians 6 gives us some armor that we're supposed to wear. Remember that? The Christian armor. Well, that's part of that, is that courage and that faith to withstand the wiles of the devil. And so, too, you can imagine these 6 guys standing there and saying, well, man, I wish they'd get across. Let's just go. I can imagine them thinking that. And they knew they couldn't, though. They knew they had been commissioned by God through Joshua to do this task. Remember that this ark, they didn't put it on no cart and carry it. It was carried by these guys everywhere they went. Okay? Whenever the only time they didn't carry it is when it was set, that the tent was set up, the tabernacle was set up, all the furniture in place and the curtain put in. Then they'd bring that ark in and put it into the Holy of Holy place with this kind of order. So that ark was being carried, not carried by a wagon. Now remember, David tried that one time. Remember, the ark had been gone and been captured by the Philistines, and then it had been, the Philistines said, hey, we can't deal with this no more. We got to get rid of this thing. So they turned it loose, and the cattle headed back towards Israel. And it got to this first town, and the town said, oh, look, it's the ark. And they said, oh, boy, and they rejoiced. And next thing you know, they're peeking into the ark. And what happened to them? God sent a plague on them. Okay? They knew they weren't supposed to do that. That was God's holy Ark of the Covenant. It was a religious, not meant to be messed with, not meant to be touched. It was designed to be a record of God's doing with man, and according to the law and according to grace. You see, the box would represent where the law was being held. It also had a pot of manna there about the grace of God. Remember that? And how God's man Aaron had been chosen as the one that would lead the people as the high priest of Israel. So here now we see again, next we see that Joshua closely followed his orders that he had received from Moses, and he didn't do anything without divine command. And that's important to note, that he didn't do anything without the Lord telling him to do it. Now what's that do to all those freelance artists that go out there and say, well, I'm going to be a preacher, I'm going to do what I want to do? There's a lot of that going on nowadays, isn't there? That's not so. That's not the way it's supposed to be. If God tells us to do something, then the leader is supposed to give the commands for it to be done, and it's done the right way. Well, here now, Joshua is obeying what Moses told him he was supposed to do, and that primarily was to not do anything without God telling you to do it. Remember, that's how Moses did it, and that's how Joshua was doing it. He's obeying the command of the Lord, and he wouldn't do anything that different without God telling him to do so. So while the priests were in turn were required to be regulated by Joshua's orders, the ministers of the gospel are to be governed solely by who? Who are the ministers of the gospel to be governed by? Anybody? Who do the gospel ministers report to? Number one, the church, and who's the head of the church? Christ. All right? The church gives the man of God the authority to preach and to pastor in the local New Testament church. Have you ever been to a licensing or an ordination of a minister of the gospel? Have any of y'all been to that? I know Lori has, because she had to be there. And Beth has, because she had to be there. But you see, whenever a minister gets ordained, he's brought, the congregation opens a business portion of the meeting, and the presbytery is seated, and then they're approved, and then the next order of business is to recommend and nominate the one that's going to be ordained to be examined by the presbytery. The presbytery then would examine him, and then they would make their recommendations back to the church for the church to accept him as the pastor or an ordained minister, whatever the occasion is. So once that was done, then the church would have a motion and a second to accept that license or that preacher that had been ordained, and then the presbytery will come around and they'll all pray over him and lay hands on him. Once that's finished, then the church accepts him. They approve his examination. They approve his presbytery, and he becomes the ordained pastor of the local New Testament church. All right, so it's important to understand that the ministers are required to follow. They are licensed by the church. They're ordained by the church, but more importantly, there are the under shepherds for the high shepherd or the great shepherd, the Lord Jesus Christ. All right? And third, now you think about the deportment of the people. Let's look at this. Let's look at verse number 10. Chapter 4, verse 10. For the priests which bear the ark stood in the midst of Jordan, now notice this, until everything was finished that the Lord commanded Joshua to speak unto the people, according to all that Moses commanded Joshua. All right? So what's that mean? Like we just said. The priests are obeying. The people are obeying. They're following after the directions of Joshua, who's following over the directions of Moses and God. All right? So they're doing this. Now look at the next phrase. It says, and the people hasted and passed over. I want you to see that. Now think about the people here. They hasted and passed over. What does that mean? How do you interpret that? They hasted and passed over. Now, you could imagine 1 million people going across one spot. Okay? And you got all of the elders, you got all of the young ones, you've got all of the livestock, you've got all of this stuff gathered together in a long line. Obviously, there's going to be some delays. Somebody might fall and you have to pick them up or something. But notice it says the people hasted. Now recall again, we made the point, here are these 6 men carrying this Ark of the Covenant, this heavy golden box. And they have to stand out there until everybody's crossed, because God is keeping that wall of water back while the ark is standing there. Okay? So the people being compassionate, thinking about the priests and their heavy labor, their burden, and they're standing there all that time, it says they hasted and got across. So we need you to understand here, they were taking in consideration that any unnecessary delay or things like that would make them go slow. Instead of poking around, they said, let's get across. Come on, these boys is holding up for us. Let's go. And they got across. It says they hasted. In other words, some of them might have run, some of them might have put it in high gear, whatever. Okay? The high gear for an ox is not too fast. Or a camel or a donkey or whatever you got, cows, sheep, all those things had to go across too. And there are these men standing there. So they didn't want to have any unnecessary delay through slowness on the part of the people. The slower they moved, the longer the priest would have to stand there bearing the ark. So there's a practical lesson in that too. The practical lesson is that God's people should do everything in their power to make the spiritual lot of God's servant easier. In other words, helping the minister to do what he needs to do and make it easier. This can be done by promptly responding to the minister's instructions, by supporting the instructions through the ministers through prayer, earnest prayer, and by being thoughtful of the minister's needs in the local New Testament church. The Lord not only marks what we do, but how we do it as well. And I got some scriptures for you on that one. 2 Chronicles. It's past Kings. Next set of books, 2 Chronicles. And go to chapter 35. 2 Chronicles 35. Second Chronicles 35. 35. 2 Chronicles 35, verse 8. All right. Now this is young King Josiah. Decides to keep a Passover. Now look at verse 8. It says, "And his princes gave willingly unto the people, to the priests, the Levites, Hilkiah and Zechariah and Jehiel, rulers of the house of God, gave unto the priests for the Passover offerings." Look at this. How many? 2,600 small cattle. That's regular cows. And how many oxen? 300. 300 oxen. Look at that. So 2,600 cows and 300 oxes. Now what is those for? For offerings. All right, look at verse 9. So Coniah also and Shemaiah and Nathaniel his brethren and Hashabiah and Jael and Jozabad, chief of the Levites, gave unto the Levites for Passover offerings 5,000 small cattle and 500 oxen. You see that? Not to be outdone, they gave just as much and more. So you think about now all that the priests had to do that day, and we can go back to Solomon's time as well. When Solomon dedicated the house of God, and they slew, all of these oxen were slain. Remember the process for the offerings. Start back here, the high priest would wash his feet in that brass laver. He'd come up here where this is the brass altar. This is outside the door of the temple or the tabernacle. And there would be an animal placed on there, and they would cut his throat. The high priest would catch a cup of that blood. He would walk past that table of showbread, and the light, the menorah is what that's called, the menorah, the 7 candlestick, golden candlestick. And then he would walk up to this altar here. This is a golden altar of incense, okay? This is the golden altar of incense, and notice it has 4 horns. And what he would take is when he's bringing that cup of blood, he's also bringing a coal in a censer from that offering, bringing it up here, and he's putting that coal on that golden altar there, and he's putting incense on top of it, and he takes his finger and puts 4 drops of blood, 1 on each horn, okay? Now he's got that done. He's lit the fire, and the incense is going up, which represents prayer. Then he goes in here. This is a curtain that separates it, and the curtain is as thick as a hand's breadth, okay? That's pretty thick, isn't it? 6-inch thick curtain. That's a heavy curtain, all right? So only he, the high priest, can go in through this curtain, and he could only do it once in a year. And he goes in and he takes a hyssop branch and dips it in that cup, and here he sprinkles all around that 7 times with that hyssop branch and the blood. So the blood would be sprinkled all over everything. And he'd do that as the atonement offering. And then those offerings would be done every day. They would do those things for the sin offerings. And notice here it says they did all of these animals that were slaughtered to represent the need. What did that represent, that slaughtering of that animal and that shedding of that blood? Right, it's a type of Christ having to be offered up as a perfect sacrifice. Now remember, when they're doing these sacrifices, they had to do them every day and every year. Okay? Anytime you sinned, and then on the special days of the festivals, and the Day of Atonement was the high day when the high priest went in. But they had to do this every day, and it kept on going and kept on going and kept on going and kept on going. The sin would be rolled back for another year and another year and another year. But when Christ offered his blood that he shed upon the cross, he only had to do it how many times? Once. He only had to die once. And his blood being sacred, being sanctified, being holy and pure, and being the blood of God, God-man, was taken into heaven and done the same way. He would take his finger and place the blood on those 4 horns, and then he would sprinkle it on that Ark of the Covenant. Now, all these things are patterned after the temple, or the temple in heaven, okay? All these things are patterned after the temple in heaven. So all these things are in the temple of heaven as well. Jesus walks up as our high priest and does this offering for us with his blood. And the Father accepts that blood and covers our sins with that blood. So here we see all of these animals were sacrificed because they had given up and hadn't been doing the sacrifices. And Josiah, the boy king, comes in and begins to read the book of God and says, oh, these sacrifices are supposed to be done. And immediately they start doing the sacrifices again and get those sacrifices moving, and they're not stingy. So God's taking note of how generous these men were that were giving these animals to be sacrificed. Now you can imagine what 5,000 cattle would be worth. Especially back in the day, you can imagine what it would take to have 5,000 cattle. And then it says 500 oxen plus the other 2,600 cattle and 300 oxen. That's a whole lot of cows in it. You can imagine what it would cost them to have that many cows. Now, nowadays, you can't even price what a cow would be. I'm telling you, they're not cheap. So, God not only observes what they do, they were offering the sacrifices like they should have been, but he also observes how they do it. Now go over to Nehemiah. Nehemiah, just a couple books over, or a couple pages over. A couple books over too, for that matter. Nehemiah after Ezra. Nehemiah. Now we just finished the study on Nehemiah. Remember Nehemiah? Who was Nehemiah? Anybody remember? He was the cupbearer to the king of Persia. He worked in the palace at Shushan. There's a name for you. Shushan. He was the cupbearer to the king, which meant he had the honor and the high position of being the cup taster as well as the food taster. All right? So back in the day, in order to get rid of a king, they'd slip a little poison in his food or his wine and he'd be gone. Well, they got wise to that trick and said, okay, I'm going to hire me a servant. I'm going to trust that servant with my life, and he's going to be the one that tastes my wine and tastes my food before I do. Now you can imagine there's a relationship that would develop there, and God has Nehemiah there with that very purpose of building that relationship with the king, so that Nehemiah ultimately would come back and restore the walls of Jerusalem and begin to serve the Lord. Look at Nehemiah chapter 3 now. And look at verse 5 and see something strange here. It says, in verse 5, it says, and next unto them the Tekoites repaired. But look at this. But their nobles put not their necks to the work of the Lord. Now, what does that mean?
Doing what they're supposed to.
Right. It was supposed to be all hands on deck to fix their section. Everybody had a section of the wall to fix. So these Tekoites were doing their jobs, but the rich said, I ain't putting my hands to it. These Tekoite nobles anyway. Not all of them did. There was a lot of people that did the labor. We see there's goldsmiths, there's women, there's different positions that in different places where different kinds of people were doing manual labor. A goldsmith doesn't do heavy labor, does he? What's he do? Little delicate work. And there were women that were doing the same work, laying rock and block and cement and all that. They were doing the same thing. But here now, these nobles said, didn't get my hands dirty. So guess who's taking note of that? God. Now go down to verse 20. It says, after him Baruch the son of Zabbai earnestly repaired the other piece from the turning of the wall to the turning of the house of Eliashib the high priest. All right, now notice how he does it. He doesn't lay around, does he? What does that mean, earnestly?
Got right on.
Yep. He didn't lollygag around. He wasn't lazy and put a block on and take a break. Okay? A lot of people are like that nowadays, ain't they? You get them to work and they do one thing and they quit. Well, he's not like that. He says he did his part earnestly. And that means he had a zeal to do the work. And I like that because we find out in Nehemiah that they had a will and a desire to build the wall. And we find out that they got that wall built in a record number of days. I think it was, let me see if it's here, in 50-something days, I believe it was. And I don't see it right away, but it's in there. How many days? It was only a few short days and they had it done. Now remember when the Babylonians came and carried off Israel, what did the state of Israel what did Jerusalem look like? The temple was basically gone. People were taking the rocks from the temple, those huge rocks, and making their own houses out of them and using them for their own purposes. So there would be rubble from the walls being torn down in the streets. And as a matter of fact, that rubble got in the way too of them trying to repair the walls. So there was all this to go, but yet their people had a desire. After Nehemiah talked to them, they had a desire to do the work, and they did the work in a record amount of time. Now you can imagine building a wall. Now I can imagine building a wall because we helped lay the foundation for this church right here. And what happened was we ordered the cement and it rained. And we couldn't get the cement truck up around the corner of the church here because it was too sharp an angle without him hitting the corner of the roof. And it was slick, so he would spin. They said, I can't get in there. And I said, uh-oh. So he backed down and he backed to the back side of the graveyard there. And he dropped his little thing down, and we had to wheelbarrow all that cement across the graveyard and into the footers here. It was 300 and something wheelbarrows of cement. Have you ever hauled a wheelbarrow of cement? Whew, it's heavy. It's heavy. And it was me and Just Over and his two sons and my two sons. We were hauling cement in the wheelbarrows. You think about that, that's labor intensive. And I had a bad back and Just Over had a bad back. And the boys were young, but they were able to help. So we got it done. But why? Because God gave us the grace to do it. And God gave Nehemiah's folks the grace to do what they needed to do. He gave them the strength that they needed to do it, to get it done. And we say that and we go into all that because God sees this. God sees your effort, your love, your zeal, your desire to do what needs to be done for the Lord. And He's taking notes of that. And He's watching to see how you're going to act in difficult circumstances. Now here are these priests now, they're having it tough. You wouldn't think carrying a box would be too tough, huh? But imagine carrying this golden box, that's solid gold, or not solid gold, but the angels are solid gold, and covered and layered in gold, standing there for hours and hours and hours, holding that box. But you see, the people had a desire to help them, back in our text. They had a desire to help them, so they hasted across. They didn't lollygag, and they didn't let things slow them down. They kept pushing and kept pushing until everybody got across. Go back to our text in chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 10, Joshua. It says, "For the priests which bear the ark stood in the midst of Jordan until everything was finished that the Lord commanded Joshua to speak unto the people, according to all that Moses commanded Joshua. And the people hasted and passed over. And it came to pass, when all the people were clean passed over, that the ark of the Lord passed over, and the priests in the presence of the people." Now remember, once they got across, they didn't just keep going. They all got across and they stopped like they were supposed to. And they had to get reorganized, and the ark would have to come back, and instead of leading the way now, would get into the middle of the what would you call it, transitory positions, or the formation. They would have to get into the middle of the formation and then begin to march again to the camp when they camped at Gilgal. Okay, that was their next camp. All right, so we stop there and we'll look at that, all of this, and we'll see who was leading the way, and we'll see some more of the details and look at some of the applications for us. But I want you to see this, how they took notice of what the priests were doing, and they said, hey, let's not delay. These boys is holding that heavy ark. Let's get it done. Let's get across. And they would start pushing them and pushing them. Okay? If they had to, they'd carry it. Like the little ones, they said, well, you know how a little one is. They're going to be stopping and picking up rocks. Saying, well, look at me. I'm copying Daddy. He's got a big rock on his shoulder. So they'd stop and pick up a rock. And you know how little ones would do. So you had to kind of push them along a little bit. And how the elders would kind of just plod along. So no doubt some of them would be picked up and set on a wagon or something and wheeled across so that they could get across a little bit faster. So they hasted and got across while these men were patiently enduring the suffering and the pain of all that. They had to wait until everybody was across. Of what would have happened if they'd have moved. Whoosh. It'd been just like Pharaoh's army, ain't it? Whoosh. God wasn't going to let that happen. So they patiently endured, and God strengthened them while they were doing it. And there's a lot of applications for us personally as well as for the ministry, how God takes care of his people when they're serving him and makes things happen the way it's supposed to happen. So think about that this week, and next time we'll take up with that spot, Lord willing, next time. All right, we'll stop there.